May we have your attention, please?
My name's Elinor Hamilton, and you've probably never heard of me. But if you ever go to London, you've probably heard my voice on the Underground.
This is Covent Garden.
You've probably also heard my husband, Phil.
This is a platform alteration.
Though he's mostly famous for saying 3 little words.
Mind the gap.
As far as I know, we're the only married couple guiding people to their destinations on the transport network. And as far as I know, we've never had an argument over which train you need to catch. Well, not over the Tannoy anyway. Over 14 years of marriage, we've had our fair share of squabbles off mic, which is all perfectly normal. But what I suppose sets us apart from most married couples who work together all day every day is that one of us is still alive and the other is dead. In this series of podcasts, I'm going to be talking to a number of famous voices, people who speak to you every day and who are just as human as the rest of us, even though you might not have heard their names or even seen their faces. They might be telling you your call can't be taken at the moment. They might be behind a famous catchphrase on a TV commercial. They might tell you what the weather's going to be like through your phone or smart speaker. These aren't automated voices. They're real people with real stories. And they're a huge part of the soundtrack to all our lives. And in some cases, they even live in our houses or in our pockets. But we don't even know them. So I'm going to tell their tales from the Tannoy. I obviously can't interview myself, and my husband is a little bit indisposed these days. So in this first episode, to help me tell my story, I've enlisted the help of 2 friends, Debbie Mack and Stephanie Hirst.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I think the point that we need to make right at the very start of this is, as we have previously discussed, this isn't a sad story. I mean, the story of your life has had some pretty huge lows, but we're talking about the coming out the other side of it, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, because there is life after death.
Yeah.
And so I was left as a young widow at 37 with 2 young children, and a husband wasn't there anymore, but we still had a business to run together.
Yeah.
And obviously he couldn't be part of it anymore. And it was how have I managed to keep afloat since the time that he died? And
did that feel incredibly pressurized? So you lose your husband, you've got 2 young boys, but then you've got this business to keep running as well.
Yeah. And obviously the business was partly me and Phil and our voices, and without Phil's voice, half of the business had gone. And he knew he was dying. He had cancer for 2 years, but we didn't know how quickly he was going to die. It sort of, you realise now that these things do happen, but it only happens to other people. But to us, it was kind of, we've got a good year left. We've got 6 months left. We've got ages. And then we were just given 2 weeks, just like that, out of the blue. No, it's just gone too far. There's nothing we can do. Go home. And that's what we did. We took him home, and he never worked after that. Although what he did do, God bless him, was he left me a list of people that he knew. Because in the voiceover industry, there are so many people that think they can do it, but actually not everybody can do it. It's a very difficult job to do. And there's a huge skill in it. And Phil had been doing it for 40 years, and he was brilliant at it. But he didn't want to just leave our clients with Google, really, and if you Google male voiceover, you could come up with you could come up with brilliant people, but also you just don't know what you're going to come up with.
Yeah.
So he was really keen that our clients were well looked after, because he said, look, nobody was expecting us to suddenly shut up shop. We thought that we had a few months to wind things down and to kind of pass work slowly over to other people, but we can't do it. So he left me with a list of people that would be a suitable replacement, that he trusted to do a really good job. Now, that's all well and good, but unfortunately, I was, as my clients knew, I was his widow. Nobody's going to phone up a widow and say, oh, by the way, can you think of somebody that sounds a little bit like your husband, because we need this topping up?
Yeah.
But at the same time, my clients sort of quietly went away for a little while, because they thought, well, I can't ring Ellie and ask her to, it's ridiculous. But I was self-employed. He didn't have life insurance. I actually needed people to come and... So for me, I wanted to work. I needed to work because it needed to give me focus. And I think that had I had the mortgage just paid off, I probably wouldn't have... I would have fallen apart, I think. I don't think I would have coped very well, because I wouldn't have known what to do with myself. I wouldn't have needed to work, but actually I needed...
It gives you a reason, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I needed to almost reinvent
purpose.
myself. But at the same time, you've got people that you want to be phoning you up and giving you work who are kind of quietly staying away for all the right reasons, God bless them. But I was also getting phone calls from psychos saying, oh, I hear the voice of Mind the Gap's died. Can I audition?
Not realising that it was your husband.
I think sometimes they knew.
Oh, no.
And I'd be like, well, thanks, but...
my
and
goodness.
I'd say, look, if you can cook a Sunday roast, if you can recite Monty Python backwards, if you can look after my kids and be the best dad in the world, okay, but actually you can't, because that was Phil's job and nobody else is going to take over his job, because his, Mind the Gap, the announcement still exists. It's going to exist forever. It's a recording. Hello, he doesn't do it live.
And his voice it's on now.
Yeah.
Somewhere on one of those tube lines, his voice will be right now at this moment in time.
Right
Wherever
now.
you're listening to this.
Yeah.
Unless it's overnight. But saying that, a lot of the tube run,
I think
on
they
a
just
weekend.
run
yeah.
quite often, don't
Gosh.
they? So, yeah.
And that's what a wonderful legacy to leave as well.
Yeah.
So you were not a voiceover when you met Phil, though. You got into that as a result of him doing it. Is that right?
No, not well. Yes and no. We were both radio DJs. I'd gone to Manchester University because although I was working at Radio Air, and I'm trying to think of the timeline, I was at Radio Air, and then I decided to go to university because I just wanted to go. Even though I was 22 or so, I just felt like I needed to further my education. So I went over to Manchester, but I chose Manchester University because there were so many radio stations there. I thought I'm bound to get a job somewhere, and Tower FM took me on, which and they're in Bolton. I did my first show at Tower FM, and there waiting for me to show me the ropes was a very nice man called Phil Sayer, who was, 48 years old, twice divorced. I knew all this because we sat on the fire escape outside and had a cigarette, and we shared our life stories. And for a few months we were just friends. But I suppose because I was in Manchester and I'd come over to Manchester in July and we didn't start term till September, didn't really know anyone else, so I spent quite a lot of time with Phil, just getting to know him, hanging out together, and it just kind of grew. It wasn't something that we expected to happen.
Yeah.
Because I was 22, he was 48, twice divorced. He was a granddad already at that point. It was like,
Wow.
It was so unlikely, but I think we both like a challenge and we like proving people wrong.
Do you know, but because we've all worked in radio stations before, so we know what radio stations are like for gossip.
Yeah.
What do you think people were saying when you were sat out there having a cigarette with Phil on the fire escape?
Do you know, they wouldn't have been saying anything because the building was empty. It was a Saturday afternoon. So we just...
So there was just both of you there
Yeah.
wow.
And there was an hour of non-stop music between his show and my show where he was supposedly going to be showing me the ropes. And because I'd been in radio for quite a long time, I knew where the faders were and what equipment, so I didn't really need to know anything other than, keep an eye on the time and make sure that at 3:00 or whatever it was, I came in and read the weather. So it was, so it was all right. But then, so I carried on at Tower. I think I did the late show through the week while I was at uni, and we got together in maybe the December or so. And we just very quickly kind of ended up living with him and not really moving out. And, and I think because I obviously had my contacts from radio over in Yorkshire and he had his over Manchester way, and between us, we knew a lot of people in the industry. It just kind of evolved. So while I was at uni, I was doing quite a lot of voice sessions on top of my uni work. And by the time I finished uni, we were already married, and, it just carried on.
So it was really quick then.
Kind of, well, the marriage or the career?
Both, yeah. Yeah. Careers can go in that way, can't they? And relationships.
Yeah, so it was 8 months from sort of getting together till we... Well, Phil always used to say that at 48, he was taking a bit of a risk putting on a full side of an LP. So, and I think it was because I was at uni, it was my first year, and it was either... And we knew that we wanted to have kids, so if we waited till the end of my third year where the work would really start ramping up, it was kind of my decision, really. I thought, well, we're going to do it anyway. We may as well do it at the end of my first year where my marks didn't count for anything. I can plan a wedding more effectively than I can if I'm trying to write a dissertation. So that's why we did it then. I mean, in hindsight, you look back, I was 22 and got married in 8 months. How stupid, what were we thinking? But actually, it
was
seemed
the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do at the time.
And youth gives you some form of energy, doesn't it? It gives you something.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing Phil at 48 was feeding that energy from you.
I think so.
He was getting lots of energy from you, which made him feel younger.
Absolutely. I mean, he was not an elderly guy ever. I mean, even, when he died 14 years later, he wasn't somebody that would sit around. I mean, it was lazy, but he wasn't athletic, and you could never accuse him of being athletic. But he was young in himself.
Yeah.
You know, he was never a fuddy-duddy. He was never an old man.
There is something about working in this industry that does keep you feeling
big kids.
Yeah, we've never grown up, ever grown up, ever.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. He'd definitely never grew up. I don't think he particularly wanted to have more children, as in it wasn't kind of like, I've always wanted to have more kids, but I think he knew that marrying somebody younger, it was going to happen. And probably, I'd say the lowest point in our marriage really was when we realised we couldn't have them naturally and we had to go through IVF. And so that was a really tough time. And I think because we knew that was another reason actually for getting married earlier, because we wanted to get married and have a couple of years of marriage before we had kids. But we knew it was going to be a bit of a process to get them. Yeah. So that would have to start happening as soon as my graduation was over. So that's why we sort of, rushed each other up the aisle.
And then you had your beautiful twin boys who are now 14.
Well, they are. But I was going to say that because he'd been divorced twice before, there weren't any venues left in Bolton that he hadn't been married in before. So we ended up having a marquee in the back garden, and it wasn't a massive back garden, it was just big enough for a marquee. So, all our friends sort of tramped through the house and into this marquee, and it was great. It was dead casual. It was a bit unconventional, and it was a bit silly, and it was exactly what we needed it to be, really. It kind of reflected us as a couple.
Yeah.
So it was a good day. And then, graduated, had 2 babies, always the higher achiever. I popped them out at once, and sideways. And the day after I gave birth, I think, the contract came through to provide the tube announcements. And we'd been talking to them for months and months. I mean, these things rattle on for ages.
Yeah.
Phil had been the voice of British Rail, I think, for a long time. He was the most apologetic man in Britain because he apologised for everybody's train being late. And I think that through that, they'd found us and needed a man and a woman. And so they came to us, and we negotiated with them. And it looked like the job wasn't going to happen. For whatever reason, I think another studio had got it. At the 11th hour, literally as I'd given birth, Phil came into the hospital waving this purchase order, and I was thinking, oh my God, okay. And I can't remember exactly how many stations there are on the Underground, but say, for example, it's 2,000, and I had to read each single station name. It's not that many, but each single station name with an upward inflection and a downward inflection.
Yeah.
And, quite often I was actually feeding a baby.
I can say with two young babies as well.
Yeah, I just used to go down into our home studio and literally put a baby on my boob and crack on. And actually, even when I listen to them now, I think, I do sound quite young and quite tired. But they get people to where they need to be. So that's okay.
That's the main thing.
I was down in London a couple of weeks ago and obviously went on the London Underground, heard your voice a lot. And next time I go to London now, I'll be thinking, did she voice that with a baby on her boob? That's what I'm going to be thinking.
Well, you never know.
Which it kind of takes us down the avenue of boobs.
Oh, yes, we like talking about boobs.
After losing Phil, you then have your own cancer battle.
Yeah. When Phil was dying, I noticed a lump in my left breast, and I didn't say anything. And I also just thought, well, it can't be anything. But I couldn't have possibly told Phil because he had enough to think about. And why worry him? He didn't need to. There was nothing that he could have done. But I mentioned it actually to a GP friend at his funeral, at the wake. And she was on her way. And I said, she lived around the corner. And I said, by the way, this is completely crazy, but is there any chance you could just pop round and have a look? We'll have a bottle of wine and, make a night of it. But I'm just a bit concerned. And she did. And there were just a few little things that made her think, I think I need to see you in surgery. And the process then went on probably for a good 3 or 4 months, actually, that it took them to diagnose it. But yeah, they diagnosed me with breast cancer in the August.
Do it's madness, isn't it? Because I can imagine that lady doctor friend of yours probably thought she's just panicking because of what's just happened.
Yeah.
There is absolutely no way.
Exactly.
And then...
I know. And I don't think any of us really thought for 1 second that it could be. And she was probably just humouring me, really, bless her. She probably just thought, well, I just need to put your mind at rest. And actually, I think she said, when I described the symptoms and she'd had a feel, and even afterwards she said, I kind of knew that it wasn't quite right, actually. And so she must have, because she was a friend as well, she had to kind of hold that in. She couldn't have told me. And actually, there was nothing that she could have done until the biopsy had come back. But actually, the first scan revealed nothing. And it was the second time that I'm so grateful to my oncologist, because she said, I just want to see you again. I can definitely feel something. I want to see you again, maybe after a period. Come back maybe after 6 weeks when you're in a different point in your cycle.
Yeah.
So I went back and she said, I'm still not sure. Let's have a biopsy. And it was the biopsy that revealed what they thought were 3 very small tumours. They thought it was very much curable. It's, I thought, thank God, because having seen Phil go through esophageal cancer, which is a horrible cancer to go through because it's within the body. So the operation just to get the cancer out is horrendous.
Yeah.
And he had to be fed through a tube. And it was just awful. And he was days and days in intensive care. So for me to kind of think, well, it's just a little bit of breast cancer. They'll just chop a bit of my breast out and that's it.
Yeah.
Job done. And I felt very grateful that I had what seemed to be a fairly easy cancer. But then fast forward to the surgery, they took the cancer out and it turned out it wasn't 3 little tumours. It was 1 giant tumour that was going into my skin, into my chest wall, into my lymph nodes. And they said, actually, we don't know whether it's curable now. We'll have to give you a full mastectomy and see in January. And this was November.
And at this point, what is going through your mind?
I think the worst thing was knowing that the boys had nobody else. And I think that's when you start to think, what do I do? What are they going to do? Because I have relatives, but they don't live anywhere nearby. We've got friends nearby, but would they really want to take on our children that aren't theirs? The problem I think that my boys had was they knew as well. They knew, although I shielded that bit of the news from them, it was always, no, my cancer's different from Dad's cancer, but they'd watched their dad die. They literally watched him die. They held his hand as he passed away. And to then say to them 4 months later, oh, no, it's not going to happen to me. Because the problem was, of course, having been told 2 or 3 weeks before Phil died that, no, I think we think you've got months. We knew it was terminal, but we felt we had a long time. For it to suddenly change, they'd already seen that sudden change. So they didn't believe a word of it. And they thought they were going to be orphaned. And how could I possibly tell them that they weren't? And then when I started the chemo and I started with, in the same situation that their dad was in, retching into a bowl, going bald and just unable to really do very much, they saw it all again and they couldn't possibly believe that there would be any other outcome. And it was very hard for me to accept that there'd be any other outcome because I'd only ever seen, and of course, God bless her, one of their friends from school, their mum died just the day after my first surgery, I think, or the day before, of breast cancer that had apparently been curable and then wasn't. And so they'd just seen so much of this heartbreak, they couldn't see any other way of it. Was just awful.
As a mum of boys as well, or just as a mum, regardless of whether they're boys or not, it's just the fact the amount that you were taking on, you were still grieving yourself when you found out this information.
Yeah.
And then as a parent, you're trying to think of how to put this information across to your children who are also grieving and the immense pressure that you were under.
Yeah.
I can't even bear to think about it.
But, again, it's a bit like Phil leaving us without any kind of, when I needed to work, I'm actually glad that I needed to work. And I'm glad that I did continue to work. Yeah. Because actually, I don't know what I would have done if I'd have been able to just sit down and grieve and be bald. I'd probably have fallen apart. And in fact, I had this business that I needed to build up and I needed to kind of turn it from one thing to another. Yeah. I needed to make something of it because we had no other source of income apart from whatever I could bring in. So actually I needed to the wider world. I needed to pretend that everything was not exactly fine. I didn't want anyone to think that I could possibly have forgotten Phil, but I didn't want to make it look like I wasn't working. Because I was working. And I was very fortunate in a way because I worked from home. So it's not like I was a scaffolder going off to work and working in all weathers. I was actually able, if I needed to work in my pyjamas. And I did sometimes. I sometimes had to. So
I do.
Yeah.
Don't we all? Yeah. But you did have an outlet and that was with your writing.
Yeah. I decided actually long before Phil died, when he got ill, I started to write a blog, which was anonymous. It's still anonymous. It's probably one that could, if you went digging hard enough, you would find it. But for me, it was something that I wanted to do that was under a pseudonym simply because I could just be myself, because Phil's death made the papers. It made the international news, actually. So because of that, he'd suddenly become, instead of just, my husband and the boy's dad, he'd become somebody, and he hadn't sort of probably felt like somebody for 20 years because he used to read the news on the television. But since then, he didn't think he was anyone. And then all of a sudden this Mind the Gap man has died. It gave him... I suppose it made him famous again. And because of that, I didn't want this blog and how I was really feeling, and the fact that I was swearing an awful lot because I needed to swear. I mean, the weird thing is I've written blogs in the last 18 months or so when life has got more into an even keel. And I've realised that although my tagline is kind of swears a lot, or sweary wanted widow, or whatever it was, I don't actually swear anymore. I just seem to have stopped. I mean, I do in normal life, but...
Anybody that follows you on social media, you are so funny. Your writing is so funny. And even because I've read some of the stuff that you did write at the time, you still injected humour into it.
Yeah, well, I just think that Phil would want that. He found the funny in everything. And when they told him that he only had 2 weeks, instead of sitting there crying, I was in floods of tears, obviously. I'm just thinking, well, what the hell are we going to do? And he sort of sat back in his chair and went, well, I think a bag for life would be an unwise investment at this point, wouldn't it? And that was classic Phil, he couldn't have, in fact, what he really wanted to do, and he never got round to it. And I think because in the last 2 weeks, he started to sound very poorly. But if he had had the time, he would have recorded an announcement for his funeral to say, the coffin arriving at platform 1. He just wanted to do something, he just wanted to raise a smile at every given opportunity. And I think that the tumour humour was what got him through. And he hated the fact that he was dying. He hated the fact that he was leaving us. He adored his boys. You wouldn't have met a dad that was more devoted to his kids than Phil, because he just loved them so much, and he couldn't bear the idea of leaving us. But he knew he had to, and he was very stoical about it. And he used to sit there and say, well... So, for example, when David Bowie died, he got quite cross with the Rolling News in the end, because he said, yes, I know he was a great guy. He was a massive fan. But he said, but he's had an amazing career. He's in his 60s. I've had an amazing career. I'm in my 60s. I've got everything that I could possibly want. I've got a wife. I've got a family. I've got a home. I go to bed at night in a warm, safe bed. Actually, I'm not on a battlefield. I'm not, I'm not in Auschwitz. I don't know. He was just quite realistic about things that a lot of people forget. I think we can forget how lucky we are.
Yeah.
And I think that if my cancer had raced away and if I hadn't made it, I still like to think that I would have made a joke out of it, probably.
But I think we all need to find that humour in things, don't we? I think if some people who take life too seriously, it can really eat them up, and that's when they start to become bitter and negative.
Yeah.
But I think if you've got a sunny disposition on life, and you're very much, as a tapper cup, a glass half full. Yeah. It's not working. But yeah, if you tap that metaphorical glass that was half full, there is there's that humour there, isn't there?
Definitely.
And you need that.
And also, if you give off that kind of energy, you attract that, which kind of brings us on to...
Well, yeah. I mean, I genuinely think, I've always felt that because Phil was so sure about how he wanted me to be happy, the boys needed to keep, basically he trusted me to do as I needed to do with the boys, and to how to bring them up and to make the decisions that we would have made together. And I found that really hard at first. But one of the things that he said to me before he died, very, very late on, we'd had these conversations for a long time, for many years, because of course there was a massive age gap. So we'd always had these conversations about if one of us dies first, and obviously it's going to be you, Phil, and we used to kind of make a joke of it. But underlying all of that was the promise that we made to each other, which was if one of us dies, you must carry on being happy. And when I was going through the cancer treatment, I couldn't imagine, apart from anything else, I've been told that I needed a mastectomy and I was going to go bald just after my husband had died, how I would ever find a man that would want me in that state. I mean, it petrified me. I didn't want to ever be in another relationship with anybody else. Couldn't imagine being with anyone other than Phil. But the fact that I was going to be eventually one day probably on the market with one boob and, you know, obviously my hair might have grown back by then, but it was all just kind of, no, this is not how it was meant to be. You know, if you're going to have breast cancer, can I at least be with somebody that will love me through it? And he wasn't there. He was kind of there because I kept his ashes in a box in the studio, and I had them with me all the time. And when my treatment ended, it was about 15 months after he died, I think. Yeah, it was about 15 months after he died when the treatment ended. And I felt as if that would be a really good time for me to inter his ashes, because I knew he wanted them interred at the church where we got married down the road and where we'd had his funeral. And it just seemed that put an end to everything. It drew a line under the cancer thing. If I could let Phil go and put him in the ground and give him a grave, which he wanted, then I would know it was time to move on. Whatever that was, I walked out of the Christie Hospital in Manchester with my life ahead of me, whereas he'd been brought home in an ambulance. And I knew that I was so lucky and I had to go and live that life. Whatever it was, that's what I had to do. So the day that I interred his ashes was the day that it was a couple of days after our 15th wedding anniversary and the week that my treatment had finished. And I took this box of ashes with my children, parked in the pub car park over the road, and wandered over to the church, and with the vicar and a few friends, we placed him in the ground and we said goodbye and we walked away. And I knew that whatever life had in front of me, you know, it was, there may be a man involved at some point, but the life was mine to take. You know, it was a new life. I walked into a new life, whatever that was. And because I'd been told on chemo I couldn't really fly very soon, we booked a cruise, me and the boys, and we went on this cruise for a couple of weeks at the end of August, I think, that year. And then in September, I came back, my hair had started to grow back. I just started to feel really, really well. But the boys kept saying to me, oh, God, Mum, you need to stop crying all the time and you need to get a boyfriend. And I was like, I don't think I do, because I really didn't. I mean, I couldn't imagine the idea of a boyfriend, especially not because I was, you know, had one boob and had this kind of crew cut by then. You know, I just thought, there's no way I'm going to go on. And they just sort of pushed me. And I think we actually just made a bit of a joke of it. We went on to eHarmony and I had a couple of glasses of wine, and between us, we were kind of setting up this profile, me and I think they were 12 years old then. And I didn't do a profile. I wasn't desperate. You know, so I had a picture of me squinting at our weird Dalmatian, and it said, "What are your hobbies? How do you spend your spare time?" And I put things like, "Oh, refereeing fights between twin boys," and you know, I didn't put anything like, "Oh, yes, I like running and cycling," and you know, pop music. I just thought I actually just took the piss because I didn't really want to be there. I was doing it to shut the boys up. But anyway, I was flicking through and there was like Pat in his anorak, and then there was Wayne who had a picture of his car, and I just thought I'm just not interested. If you can't even take your anorak off for your dating profile picture, I'm not sending you a message. But then there was this really nice looking chap who had a really lovely smile, and it said he was only up the road in Rosendale, and he was, you know, my sort of age, and he just looked nice. And I looked at his profile and thought, he seems like a nice, but what I wanted to do was not necessarily even date him. I just thought, well, if I just send him a message, he's only up the road and he doesn't look like a psycho, so he might at least be able to tell me what dating's like, because I'm really not, you know, I thought it would take months for me to even go on a date. I thought, well, at least by then I'll have my new boob and have my hair, and, you know, I wasn't interested in a date. So I sent him a message and I just said, "Hi, you don't look mad and you only live up the road. I'm new." And he wrote back probably 24 hours later, by which time I was a bit like, he's not written back.
Welcome back to the world of dating. Yeah.
Great big slap in the face.
I know.
Great.
But it turned out he was running an ultra marathon through the Alps at the time, so he was in Switzerland.
That's all right then.
So he'd done a couple of marathons already and got my message and thought, oh, you know, you sound. And I thought, oh, well, I'm running the London Marathon in April, so you can tell me all about that. And we just got this conversation going, and it was really weird because from the start we started taking the piss out of each other. It was just amazing. Anyway, a couple of days later, he's back home, hobbling around his house, you know, with a bad ankle and, you know, a medal around his neck or whatever, presumably wearing clothes as well, I do not know. And he sent me a message to say, "I'm really sorry, I need to tell you something." We hadn't met at that point, but we had sort of put something vague in the diary for maybe Wednesday or Thursday that week. This was maybe Monday. And he said, "I really need to tell you something, because if we end up having a relationship, I really believe in trust and openness. And I think if I know this and I don't tell you before we meet for our date, then this, you're not ever going to trust me again. So I want you to know that I've stalked you on the internet and I know who you are. But the weird thing is that when Phil died, I read the newspaper and then I read another newspaper and another one. He said, I couldn't get the story out of my head and I didn't know why. And it was just really odd because actually at that time he was married still. His marriage broke up maybe 2 or 3 months after that. We'd been, each of us kind of forced into singledom at about the same time. But yeah, there was definitely an overlap. He was still married at that point, and he thought nothing of it apart from maybe it's because he works in London and he takes tubes all the time, or maybe because he lives up near Bolton. So because it was he wasn't sure, but there was just something about that story that just grabbed him. Anyway, the good news is that we hit it off. And that was nearly 2 years ago. So it will have been September 2017. And we've been together ever since. It's been, just a wonderful, it's developed very slowly. Neither of us were in a rush. We've learned so much from each other because he always thought he went for blondes with big boobs, and I couldn't offer either a full set of boobs or blonde or any hair, in fact. So he fell in love with me when I still had one boob and a very short dark haircut. And I think that he realised that it was, you don't actually fall for the body, you fall for the mind and the connection and actually,
soul, isn't it?
Yeah. And as it happens, over the last few months and the last couple of years, I guess we both developed and I've ended up with a full head of hair and now I've got a full set of boobs. And, it's actually deferred gratification is a big buzzword in our relationship. So he's finally got what he wanted, but it just took a long time to wait. But it was sort of, not quite this time last year, but September time. I knew it was September when we first started to see each other. I remember thinking to myself in September, I can't work out exactly what the date was that I first messaged him because it was through eHarmony, the dating app. And obviously within a couple of weeks, we both deleted our apps and, that was that. So there was no way of really knowing exactly what the first day was that I first got in touch with him. So I thought, well, why don't I look through Strava, which is the athlete's Facebook, to kind of see when he was doing this run through the Alps, because I remember he'd already done 2. So it must have been halfway through. That's the day that would be our anniversary, because I just kind of wanted to know, how long have we been together? So I went through scrolling through Strava and found out that it was whatever day. I mean, I can't even remember what the day was. It was like something like the 8th of September or something. So, and I was kind of vaguely scrolling back and not really thinking anything of it. And you know how when you're just vaguely not even looking through social media, you're just scrolling. But I saw this map that looked really familiar. And I thought, hang on, I've run that route before. I've cycled that route. It's the route between his house and my house, which is about 12 miles. And I thought, well, what was he doing coming down to Bolton? And I remembered that he'd had a date in the pub over the road from where my husband's buried about 2 or 3 months before we met. He told me about it and he said, oh, yeah, I've been to the Crofters before. Okay. And it was weird because I think the Crofters was the pub halfway between him and this woman. So, she must have lived a fair way away. It was just the halfway point. They picked it as being, a suitable place to meet. As it happened, the date didn't really go anywhere, but they'd had a nice time. But he'd parked his car in the car park on that Saturday night and then got a taxi home and cycled back to pick up his car. But the interesting thing was, when I looked at the map on Strava and I looked at the date and the time, I realised that at the same date, at the same time, he'd appeared on his bike to pick up his car from that car park when I'd arrived with my husband's ashes in a box, waiting to put them in the churchyard.
That is madness.
Isn't it?
Oh, my God.
Oh. And we would have crossed in the car park and we wouldn't have known. And even if he had have seen me, he'd have thought, who's that weird bald woman with 2 squabbling teenagers and the big carrier bag? Because, of course, I'd put Phil's ashes in a bag for life because I thought that would be funny. And he would have been this lycra-clad lunatic trying to shoehorn a bicycle into the back of a Jaguar, and I would have just thought, what a prat. So it would never have been the right time for us to meet, but it feels as if somebody somewhere, and I think I know who, placed us in that part of town at exactly the same time to just put us nearby, and then we went our separate ways.
Sliding doors thing, isn't it?
Kind of, yeah. And it's just felt from the start that things things just have happened, not just for a reason.
More at work,
Do you think that our lives are kind of mapped out for us already? Things are meant to happen before we're born? Because some people believe in that, don't they?
I'm not sure. I mean, sometimes I think it's really nice to just find whatever it is that's happened to you and find a positive in it, whatever happens. So, for example, when I was diagnosed, it felt as if the room was closing in on me. It was just horrendous. But I remember sitting there thinking, something has got to come out of this. I'm either going to learn something or I'm going to write the book. Something's got to come from this, because why is this happening if it's not for something positive? Whereas I think that maybe a few years ago I would have just thought, well, that's it. Nothing good ever happens to me. And people used to say to me, oh, you must have been really bad in a former life. And they were only joking, but it's like, but I haven't. I've always been kind. What is the matter with you? It's just one of those things. Obviously, I wish none of this had ever happened. I wish that Phil hadn't died. I wish my boys weren't without their dad. I wish we'd never gone through all of that. But I can't bring him back, and I can't change anything. I can't change the fact that I had cancer. Life just does stuff. I can choose how I see it.
You don't let it define you?
Not at all. No. And in fact, I would even go so far as to say I wouldn't, even though cancer has defined me, because it took my husband, it took my boob, it took a lot of my life. But I actually want to use it as a force for good and to say, but aren't I lucky that I've been given a second chance? I've had these 2 lives. I had my wonderful life with Phil, our 2 gorgeous boys. We had so much fun. We had a great business together. And he taught me so much. And of course, I would, in a heartbeat, I would have changed it. I would never have let it happen. But it has happened. So let's benefit from it. Because I'm going to be here a lot longer than Phil was, I hope. I'm here now. So why not just enjoy what I've got?
Absolutely. What a great outlook on life you have. I mean, seriously, your story is just unbelievable. I just think the way that you have handled things is so different to how most people do, because as Steph mentioned before, people can get eaten up by it, and
they can.
You need to rise from the embers.
You do. And I actually think sometimes I joined some of the widowed parents networks, some of the Facebook groups and things. And actually after a while, and I think maybe my story was slightly different because I was widowed with breast cancer. So I kind of felt like being widowed is the only thing you've got to worry about. And I couldn't be a breast cancer patient because they were all upset about having breast cancer. I'm thinking, well, if only breast cancer was the only thing I had to worry about. So I didn't really fit anywhere. And I think in some ways that probably helped to push me on to whatever my next thing was, because I think a lot of people who are either widowed or have cancer, they can't move on from it. And
it comes back to the allowing it to define you thing, doesn't it? It allows whatever you go through in life. Some people it sticks with them.
Yeah.
And it's like a cloud that carries them, that, they're carried around under.
Yeah.
Or you kind of go, well, that happened. Yes, it's part of who I am, but I'm not going to carry it around with me. I'm going to get on with my life and try and make the best of what I can.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it is, as Debbie was saying, it's an incredible story. And have you thought about, we talked about a blog earlier, but writing a book?
Yeah.
Because I think that this is such a story, and you have profile, but also there's a story there which I think would help a lot of people
I think so,
who a journey like yours, or maybe just dealing with one cancer in their lives or one traumatic experience, they've let it define them.
Yeah.
And whereas you haven't, and that is, people can take strength from that.
I would say, although it hasn't defined me as such, it's kind of shaped me into who I am, and I can't change that. And I think that I probably do refer back to losing Phil, or I talk about him all the time because he's my boy's dad and he's my husband, and he's part of our lives. He always will be. And I probably make more jokes than I probably should about the fact that I had one boob, and obviously I've got 2 now, and I can't be the one-tit wonder anymore. And it's very disappointing. But so I think I do. Everybody lets their experiences define them to a certain extent. But I think the problem with writing a book, and I will do it, but just probably for the last couple of years, just while I've been with Ed and while things have just started to go back onto an even keel, I've just found this happiness that I haven't had for so long, because in fact, it's worse, I think, when you're with somebody that's got cancer. When you're the carer, that's the worst part, because everything's on your shoulders. When you're the one with cancer, people kind of lay off you a little bit more. But when it's you that's carrying the whole everything. The stress is unbelievable. So I've just enjoyed the last couple of years of not really having any stress apart from when's my surgery going to be? Oh, it was in February. Oh, right, that's gone well, great. And that was the only real thing that I had to worry about, apart from obviously dealing with two little boys who are, well, they're now 14. They're not little boys anymore, but dealing with teenage twins, which is a bit of a, grieving twins who are teenagers is not much fun. But apart from that, if I go back to those blogs that I wrote 3 or 4 years ago, I don't remember that person. And I'm not saying I don't like her. She was a very good person. She was a very good wife. But I'm a better girlfriend than I ever was a wife because I'm widowed, because I spent 18 months in an empty bed wishing that Phil would just fart or snore just once, when actually when he was alive I'd want to pummel him with a bedside lamp because it was so annoying, because that's what you do when you're married and you don't know anything else. But if Ed snores in the night, I just think, oh, he's alive, and I've got that tolerance that I wouldn't have had before, and I'm only that person because of the experiences.
Yeah,
that
I suppose it has shaped you, but it's not defining you in the sense that you are drawing the positivity out of it.
Yeah,
and you realise that you're only on this planet once, and you need to find happiness for the sake of your boys as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is what you have gone and done. And I think that is just amazing.
Oh, thank you. I think it's possibly worth mentioning, though, that I guess my optimism in all of this is a choice. I've received so much kindness since Phil died from friends and strangers, and especially people in the voiceover industry, which has just been the most amazing industry to work in and to make friends in, that despite having had some really tough times, it makes me see the world and obviously other people in a really positive way, which I don't think I would have seen them that way had it not been for what I've been through, had I not lost Phil, had he not died. I guess I don't really want to talk about the 2 years leading up to his death because they were horrible, probably the worst 2 years of our lives. And I want to remember the fabulous, the funny, the wonderful family man that Phil was. And I suppose what's lovely about the recordings on the Underground is that they're from the days when he was exactly that. He was young, he was, younger, he was healthy, he was at his prime, I suppose. And I guess it's nice to think that we both will always work together on the Underground somewhere, every day. The two of us will be in partnership, guiding the rest of the world to their destination. And I just find that really, really comforting that even though he's not alive anymore, he is still alive. He's still working. He's still part of my life, and I'm part of his life. And I love the fact that together we both guide Ed to work every single day. And I find that really special because it's typical of Phil to love and guide and care for anyone who loves me and his beloved boys. It's just so like him, and what a wonderful legacy.
This train terminates here. All change, please. All change.
You've been listening to Tales from the Tannoy with Elinor Hamilton, Debbie Mack and Stephanie Hirst, and with music from Beats Bakery. This podcast was produced by Carl Svensson at Tadar Media.